Welcome to the Gen Z Marketer podcast, where we have marketing conversations and everything in between. Here we talk about marketing, branding, e commerce, and the power of integrated marketing communication. I'm your host, Jamia O'Malley, a strategist passionate and specializing in branding and marketing for e commerce. If you're from the Philippines, you may have heard about a recent event in which a huge brand announced a new endorser. So this endorser's political views are the point of controversy, and once they were revealed as an endorser, there was immediate backlash from consumers. For this episode, let's digest the particulars of this case and whether a brand's chosen ambassadors and their personal lives have an impact on a brand. Before we get to it, don't forget to support the show by following the podcast to get notified on the latest uploads. So, what is the case study that we're talking about? What exactly happened? A few weeks ago, Shopee Philippines announced a new brand endorser. So, Toni Gonzaga, a multimedia personality in the country, was chosen. When Shopee shared a teaser a day before the announcement, there were already theories that Gonzaga was the endorser. There were a lot of discussions online, most of which weren't good prior to the announcement. On the day Shopee was set to announce the new endorser, a notification popped up on the app in which the platform had a survey about consumer preferences on brand endorsers and ambassadors. So this announcement, or Gonzaga, was officially announced as the platform's endorser prior to the 10/10 sale event. Prior to the announcement and once Gonzaga was officially announced as the endorser, Shopee was trending in social media. It wasn't only Shopee that was trending. Lazada was trending as well. There were massive call outs to boycott Shopee and switch to Lazada, which is why Lazada got attention. It wasn't just buyers who swore off to boycott Shopee. Some sellers also announced switching to Lazada and removing their shops in Shopee altogether. Shopee released a statement shortly after, justifying or explaining their choice of an endorser. Gonzaga also released a statement of how grateful she was for the engagements in social media when she was announced as endorser. So, what was the backlash? Like, why was there a huge backlash with Gonzaga being an endorser of Shopee? So, Gonzaga is actually a staunch supporter of the son of the Philippines' former dictator and current President Marcos. Her affiliation and beliefs are the point of controversy as a personality. Prior to Shopee's announcement, there was also a report about their massive layoffs, which was released by a media outlet. This was something happening in the Philippines in recent months. However, for those who are familiar with the e-commerce industry, you would know or it is notable that this is the case for most of Shopee's offices in different countries. There were already reports before and in the previous months on how some of the job offers they gave to new employees were suddenly revoked and how there were massive retrenchments in different countries too. The news of the Shopee layoffs in the Philippines came out in the same week they announced a new endorser. There was speculation from the public that the layoffs were made to make way for the expensive talent fee of Gonzaga. And then shortly after the announcement, there were already reports from sellers that their sales dipped in 1010, which they attributed to the new endorser. Again, this last one is not entirely confirmed. And of course, in terms of the layoffs, there again, I would say this is all speculation based on public opinion. So now let's talk about this case. Let's deep dive and analyze exactly what happened and the backlash. Our question for this episode is: are brands impacted by their brand ambassador or endorser's beliefs and choices? We already talked about a similar topic in the podcast, which is about whether brands should be apolitical from season 2, episode 1. You can check that out because this is somewhat connected to that. My answer to the question is yes. Brands are impacted by their brand ambassador or endorsers' beliefs and choices. If you asked that question years ago, of course, the answer would be different. So, what's different this time? Why does a brand endorser's life affect a brand? So, most attribute it to the values and beliefs of the current youth. You have your millennials, Gen Z, and even the up and coming Generation Alpha. We already talked about these generations in previous episodes as well. So these generations are more socially aware than their predecessors and take social responsibility very seriously. When we also go back to branding, again, I've talked about this in previous episodes, we know that brand identity is where we set a brand's personality and values. Branding heavily influences a business as a whole. It affects your visuals, your communications, your strategies, and basically the way you do business. So, with your brand identity in mind, when you make business decisions, such as choosing a brand ambassador, you are choosing based on who you are, what your values are, your identity is, and more. After all, that's the reason why they are called ambassadors or endorsers in the first place. They are an extension of who you are and are meant to amplify your brand's identity and message. Millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha sees this more than ever with brands. We have mentioned before how these generations can see through BS and they will call you out as such. So is it because of cancel culture? Some would say that's the case and even consider it toxic. But if we go back to why cancel culture became prevalent, it all boils down to calls for accountability. Cancel culture is about wanting people to be accountable and take responsibility for their actions. This is why brands are quote unquote canceled when they make business decisions that are against humanity or their brand values. For this case with brand ambassadors, who you choose is practically the personification of your brand. Are we being too political with brands? As mentioned, most consumers now recognize their own social responsibility, and that's the same with brands. That is why there are brands that have really strong corporate social responsibility or CSR efforts. But is there a line when it comes to politicizing brands? After all, with corporate social responsibility, it's usually about environmental or social issues. I would go back to what I mentioned in the previous episode on brands being apolitical. Brands must keep in mind that every action warrants an equal reaction. So their chosen spokespersons are representations of who they are. After all, that's the same with employees, right? We hold employees accountable with their behavior as representatives of the company. So that's the same with endorsers. And if you choose a controversial brand ambassador or endorser, expect that their controversies will affect you. After all, you chose them as what we said, the personification of your brand, and there's a relationship between you and these ambassadors. So let's go back to our case. Let's say that the news about Shopee's layoffs weren't mentioned or became public knowledge, or let's say that's not, happening at all. Let's just focus on announcing a new endorser, who is Gonzaga. Would the backlash be as bad? Maybe there's less backlash. We can't really tell. Of course, it already happened in the past. But I do feel that, or I do think that there is still backlash because there's still that concern with Gonzaga's political views. As we said, controversy follows a personality and affects the brands they represent. This case with Shopee shows that if you're a purposeful brand, that's conscious of your impact and choices, then you have meaningful decisions for your business. It would reflect on your branding, marketing, your services, your products, and more. As we said, brand identity influences the whole business. However, there are brands or businesses that are not as conscious or concerned with their social impact. That's unfortunately a reality, even though there are a lot of people who prefer brands that have social impact. So, if that's the case, these businesses may not look at these things and may be focused on numbers, profitability, and more. Like with Shopee, that chose Gonzaga due to her star power. So, if we're going to talk about whether Shopee's endorser is a hit or a miss, I would have to go back on their actual branding, then their intended target market. If Gonzaga is representation of Shopee's brand identity and is the kind of endorser that their market appreciates, then Shopee did what's on brand for them. But if they are a brand that wants to make a social impact and wants to resonate with audiences that are as responsible or as conscious with social issues, then this was a miss for them. That is why they actually receive backlash because they have audiences who are socially responsible and expect Shopee, a brand they use, to do the same. So, what is the takeaway for marketers? I would say that my episode on whether brands should be apolitical is still relevant to this. I do recommend that you check that out. It's from season 2, episode 1. From that episode, I would also reiterate in relation to this episode that brands need to do things that are at par with their identity and values, as well as what would be meaningful to their audience. And again, social responsibility is more relevant now to the youth, and they should be mindful of their actions if they want to relate to that audience. Personally, this is something from me in terms of my personal thoughts as a marketer and a consumer. I would say that brands should be more intentional with their choices if they want to make meaningful impact to audiences and society. So if you want to learn more about this case, I have linked some resources on the description about what happened with Shopee. This is for, of course, our friends who aren't from the Philippines. So, what are your thoughts on this episode and what do you want to hear more of? Let me know at the Gen Z Marketer Podcast on Facebook and at Gen Z MKT on Instagram.